The Realm of the Unreal. 1. For a part of the distance between Auburn and Newcastle, the road, first on one side of a creek and then on the other, occupies the whole bottom of the ravine, being partly cut out of the steep hillside, and partly built up with boulders removed from the creek bed by the miners. The hills are wooded. The course of the ravine is sinuous. In a dark night, careful driving is required in order not to go off into the water. The night that I have in memory was dark, the creek a torrent, swollen by a recent storm. I had driven up from Newcastle and was within about a mile of Auburn in the darkest and narrowest part of the ravine, looking intently ahead of my horse for the roadway. Suddenly I saw a man almost under the animal's nose, and reined in with a jerk that came near setting the creature upon its haunches. "I beg your pardon," I said. "I did not see you, sir." "You could hardly be expected to see me," the man replied civilly, approaching the side of the vehicle, "and the noise of the creek prevented my hearing you." I at once recognized the voice, although 5 years had passed since I had heard it. I was not particularly well pleased to hear it now. "You are Dr. Dorrimore, I think," said I. "Yes, and you are my good friend Mr. Manrich. I am more than glad to see you, the excess," he added with a light laugh, "being due to the fact that I am going your way and naturally expect an invitation to ride with you." "Which I extend with all my heart." This was not altogether true. Dr. Dorrimore thanked me as he seated himself beside me, and I drove cautiously forward as before. Doubtless it is fancy, but it seems to me, now that the remaining distance was made in a chill fog, that I was uncomfortably cold, that the way was longer than ever before, and the town, when we reached it, cheerless, forbidding, and desolate. It must have been early in the evening, yet I do not recollect a light in any of the houses, nor a living thing in the streets. Dorrimore explained at some length how he happened to be there, and where he had been during the years that had elapsed since I had seen him. I recall the facts of the narrative, but none of the facts narrated. He had been in foreign countries, and had returned. This is all that my memory retains, and this I already knew. As to myself, I cannot remember that I spoke a word, though doubtless I did. Of one thing I am distinctly conscious. The man's presence at my side was strangely distasteful and disquieting, so much so that when I at last pulled up under the lights of the Putnam house, I experienced a sense of having escaped some spiritual peril of a nature peculiarly forbidding. This sense of relief was somewhat modified by the discovery that Dr. Dorrimore was living at the same hotel. 2. In particular explanation of my feelings regarding Dr. Dorrimore, I will relate briefly the circumstances under which I had met him some years before. One evening, a half-dozen men, of whom I was one, were sitting in the library of the Bohemian Club in San Francisco. The conversation had turned to the subject of sleight of hand and the feats of the prestidigitators, one of whom was then exhibiting at a local theatre. "These fellows are pretenders in a double sense," said one of the party. "They can do nothing which it is worth one's while to be made a dupe by. The humblest wayside jugglers in India could mystify them to the verge of lunacy." "For example, how?" asked another, lighting a cigar. "For example, by all their common and familiar performances, throwing large objects into the air which never come down, causing plants to sprout, grow visibly and blossom in bare ground chosen by spectators, putting a man into a wicker basket, piercing him through and through with a sword while he shrieks and bleeds, and then, the basket being opened, nothing is there, tossing the free end of a silken ladder into the air, mounting it, and disappearing." "Nonsense," I said, rather uncivilly, I fear. "You surely do not believe such things." "Certainly not. I have seen them too often." "But I do," said a journalist of considerable local fame as a picturesque reporter. "I have so frequently related them that nothing but observation could shake my conviction. Why, gentlemen, I have my own word for it." Nobody laughed. All were looking at something behind me. Turning in my seat, I saw a man in evening dress who had just entered the room. He was exceedingly dark, almost swarthy, with a thin face, black-bearded to the lips, an abundance of coarse black hair in some disorder, a high nose and eyes that glittered with as soulless an expression as those of a cobra. One of the group rose and introduced him as Dr. Dorrimore of Calcutta. As each of us was presented in turn, he acknowledged the fact with a profound bow in the Oriental manner, but with nothing of Oriental gravity. His smile impressed me as cynical and a trifle contemptuous. His whole demeanour I can describe only as disagreeably engaging. His presence led the conversation into other channels. He said little. I do not recall anything of what he did say. I thought his voice singularly rich and melodious, but it affected me in the same way as his eyes and smile. In a few minutes I rose to go. He also rose and put on his overcoat. "Mr. Mandrich," he said, "I am going your way." "The devil you are," I thought. "How do you know which way I am going?" Then I said, "I shall be pleased to have your company." We left the building together. No cabs were in sight. The street cars had gone to bed. There was a full moon and the cool night air was delightful. We walked up the California Street hill. I took that direction, thinking he would naturally wish to take another, toward one of the hotels. "You do not believe what is told of the Hindu jugglers?" he said abruptly. "How do you know that?" I asked. Without replying, he laid his hand lightly upon my arm, and with the other pointed to the stone sidewalk directly in front. There, almost at our feet, lay the dead body of a man, the face upturned and white in the moonlight. A sword whose hilt sparkled with gems stood fixed and upright in the breast. A pool of blood had collected on the stones of the sidewalk. I was startled and terrified, not only by what I saw, but by the circumstances under which I saw it. Repeatedly during our ascent of the hill my eyes, I thought, had traversed the whole reach of that sidewalk, from street to street. How could they have been insensible to this dreadful object now so conspicuous in the white moonlight? As my dazed faculties cleared, I observed that the body was in evening dress. The overcoat thrown wide open revealed the dress coat, the white tie, the broad expanse of shirt front pierced by the sword. And horrible revelation, the face, except for its pallor, was that of my companion. It was to the minutest detail of dress and feature Dr. Dorrimore himself. Bewildered and horrified, I turned to look for the living man. He was nowhere visible, and with an added terror I retired from the place down the hill in the direction whence I had come. I had taken but a few strides when a strong grasp upon my shoulder arrested me. I came near crying out with terror. The dead man, the sword still fixed in his breast, stood beside me. Pulling out the sword with his disengaged hand, he flung it from him, the moonlight glinting upon the jewels of its hilt and the unsullied steel of its blade. It fell with a clang upon the sidewalk ahead and vanished. The man, swarthy as before, relaxed his grasp upon my shoulder and looked at me with the same cynical regard that I had observed on first meeting him. The dead have not that look. It partly restored me, and turning my head backward, I saw the smooth white expanse of sidewalk unbroken from street to street. "What is all this nonsense, you devil?" I demanded, fiercely enough, though weak and trembling in every limb. "It is what some are pleased to call jugglery," he answered, with a light, hard laugh. He turned down Dupont Street, and I saw him no more until we met in the Auburn ravine. 3. On the day after my second meeting with Dr. Dorrimore, I did not see him. The clerk in the Putnam House explained that a slight illness confined him to his room. That afternoon, at the railway station, I was surprised and made happy by the unexpected arrival of Miss Margaret Corey and her mother from Oakland. This is not a love story. I am no story-teller, and love as it is cannot be portrayed in a literature dominated and enthralled by the debasing tyranny which sentenced letters in the name of the young girl. Under the young girl's blighting reign, or rather under the rule of those false ministers of the censure who have appointed themselves to the custody of her welfare, love veils her sacred fires, and unaware, morality expires, famished upon the sifted meal and distilled water of a prudish purveyance. Let it suffice that Miss Corey and I were engaged in marriage. She and her mother went to the hotel at which I lived, and for 2 weeks I saw her daily. That I was happy needs hardly be said. The only bar to my perfect enjoyment of those golden days was the presence of Dr. Dorrimore, whom I had felt compelled to introduce to the ladies. By them he was evidently held in favour. What could I say? I knew absolutely nothing to his discredit. His manners were those of a cultivated and considerate gentleman, and to women a man's manner is the man. On one or two occasions when I saw Miss Corey walking with him I was furious, and once had the indiscretion to protest. Asking for reasons, I had none to give, and fancied I saw in her expression a shade of contempt for the vagaries of a jealous mind. In time I grew morose and consciously disagreeable, and resolved in my madness to return to San Francisco the next day. Of this, however, I said nothing. 4. There was at Auburn an old abandoned cemetery. It was nearly in the heart of the town, yet by night it was as gruesome a place as the most dismal of human moods could crave. The railings about the plots were prostrate, decayed, or altogether gone. Many of the graves were sunken, from others grew sturdy pines, whose roots had committed unspeakable sin. The headstones were fallen and broken across. Brambles overran the ground. The fence was mostly gone, and cows and pigs wandered there at will. The place was a dishonour to the living, a calumny on the dead, a blasphemy against God. The evening of the day on which I had taken my madman's resolution to depart in anger from all that was dear to me found me in that congenial spot. The light of the half-moon fell ghostly through the foliage of trees in spots and patches, revealing much that was unsightly, and the black shadows seemed conspiracies withholding to the proper time revelations of darker import. Passing along what had been a gravel path, I saw emerging from the shadow the figure of Dr. Dorrimore. I was myself in shadow, and stood still with clenched hands and set teeth, trying to control the impulse to leap upon and strangle him. A moment later, a second figure joined him and clung to his arm. It was Margaret Corey. I cannot rightly relate what occurred. I know that I sprang forward bent upon murder. I know that I was found in the grey of the morning, bruised and bloody, with finger marks upon my throat. I was taken to the Putnam House, where for days I lay in a delirium. All this I know, for I have been told, and of my own knowledge I know that when consciousness returned with convalescence, I sent for the clerk of the hotel. "Are Mrs. Corey and her daughter still here?" I asked. "What name did you say?" "Corey." "Nobody of that name has been here." "I beg you will not trifle with me," I said petulantly. "You see that I am all right now. Tell me the truth." "I give you my word," he replied with evident sincerity. "We have had no guests of that name." His words stupefied me. I lay for a few moments in silence. Then I asked, "Where is Dr. Dorrimore?" "He left on the morning of your fight, and has not been heard of since. It was a rough deal he gave you." 5. Such are the facts of this case. Margaret Corey is now my wife. She has never seen Auburn, and during the weeks whose history, as it shaped itself in my brain, I have endeavored to relate, was living at her home in Oakland, wondering where her lover was and why he did not write. The other day I saw in the Baltimore Sun the following paragraph: "Professor Valentine Dorrimore, the hypnotist, had a large audience last night. The lecturer, who has lived most of his life in India, gave some marvelous exhibitions of his power, hypnotizing anyone who chose to submit himself to the experiment by merely looking at him. In fact, he twice hypnotized the entire audience, reporters alone exempted, making all entertain the most extraordinary illusions. The most valuable feature of the lecture was the disclosure of the methods of the Hindu jugglers in their famous performances, familiar in the mouths of travellers. The professor declares that these thaumaturgists have acquired such skill in the art which he learned at their feet, that they perform their miracles by simply throwing the spectators into a state of hypnosis and telling them what to see and hear. His assertion that a peculiarly susceptible subject may be kept in the realm of the unreal for weeks, months, and even years, dominated by whatever delusions and hallucinations the operator may from time to time suggest, is a trifle disquieting."
One Summer Night by Ambrose Bierce. The fact that Henry Armstrong was buried did not seem to prove that he was dead. He had always been a hard man to convince. that he was really buried, the testimony of his senses compelled him to admit. His posture, flat upon his back, with his hands crossed on his stomach and tied with something that he easily broke without profitably altering the situation, the strict confinement of his entire person, the black darkness and profound silence, made a body of evidence impossible to controvert, and he accepted it without cavil. But dead? No. He was only very, very ill. He had, withal, the invalid's apathy, and did not greatly concern himself about the uncommon fate that had been allotted to him. No philosopher was he, just a plain, commonplace person, gifted, for the time being, with a pathological indifference. The organ that he feared consequences with was torpid. So, with no particular apprehension for his immediate future, he fell asleep, and all was peace with Henry Armstrong. But something was going on overhead. It was a dark summer night, shot through with infrequent shimmers of lightning, silently firing a cloud lying low in the west and portending a storm. There brief, stammering illuminations brought out with ghastly distinctness the monuments and headstones of the cemetery, and seemed to set them dancing. It was not a night in which any credible witness was likely to be straying about a cemetery, so the three men who were there, digging into the grave of Henry Armstrong, felt reasonably secure. Two of them were young students from a medical college a few miles away. The third was a gigantic man known as Jess. For many years, Jess had been employed about the cemetery as a man of all work, and it was his favourite pleasantry that he knew every soul in the place. From the nature of what he was now doing, it was inferable that the place was not so populous as its register may have shown it to be. Outside the wall, at the part of the grounds farthest from the public road, were a horse and a light wagon, waiting. The work of excavation was not difficult. The earth with which the grave had been loosely filled a few hours before offered little resistance and was soon thrown out. Removal of the casket from its box was less easy, but it was taken out, for it was a prerequisite of Jess, who carefully unscrewed the cover and laid it aside, exposing the body in black trousers and white shirt. At that instant the air sprang to flame, a crackling shock of thunder stunned the world, and Henry Armstrong tranquilly sat up. With inarticulate cries, the men fled in terror, each in a different direction, for nothing on earth could two of them have been persuaded to return. But Jess was of another breed. In the grey of the morning, the two students, pallid and haggard from anxiety, and with the terror of their adventure still beating tumultuously in their blood, met at the college. "You saw it," cried one. "God, yes. What are we to do?" They went around to the rear of the building, where they saw a horse attached to a light wagon, hitched to a gatepost near the door of the dissecting room. Mechanically they entered the room. On a bench, in the obscurity, sat Jess. He rose, grinning, all eyes and teeth. "I'm waiting for my pay," he said. Stretched naked on a long table lay the body of Henry Armstrong, the head defiled with blood and clay from a blow with a spade.
2 Military Executions by Ambrose Bierce. In the spring of the year 1862, General Buell's big army lay in camp, licking itself into shape for the campaign which resulted in the victory at Shiloh. It was a raw, untrained army, although some of its fractions had seen hard enough service, with a good deal of fighting, in the mountains of western Virginia and in Kentucky. The war was young, and soldiering a new industry, imperfectly understood by the young American of the period, who found some features of it not altogether to his liking. Chief among these was an essential part of discipline, subordination. To one imbued from infancy with the fantastic fallacy that all men are born equal, unquestioning submission to authority was not easily mastered, and the American volunteer soldier in his green and salad days is among the worst known. That is how it happened that one of Buell's men, Private Bennett Story Green, committed the indiscretion of striking his officer. Later in the war he would not have done that. Like Sir Andrew Ogcheek, he would have seen him damned first. But time for reformation of his military manners was denied him, and he was promptly arrested on complaint of the officer, tried by court-martial, and sentenced to be shot. "You might have thrashed me and let it go at that," said the condemned man to the complaining witness. "That is what you used to do at school, when you were plain Will Dudley, and I was as good as you. Nobody saw me strike you. Discipline would not have suffered much." "Ben Green, I guess you're right about that," said the lieutenant. "Will you forgive me? That is what I came to see you about." There was no reply, and an officer, putting his head in at the door of the guard tent where the conversation had occurred, explained that the time allowed for the interview had expired. The next morning, when in the presence of the whole brigade, Private Green was shot to death by a squad of his comrades, Lieutenant Dudley turned his back upon the sorry performance and muttered a prayer for mercy, in which himself was included. A few weeks afterwards, as Buell's leading division was being ferried over the Tennessee River to assist in succoring Grant's beaten army, night was coming on, black and stormy. Through the wreck of battle the division moved, inch by inch, in the direction of the enemy, who had withdrawn a little to reform his lines. But for the lightning, the darkness was absolute. Never for a moment did it cease, and even when the thunder did not crack and roar, were heard the moans of the wounded, among whom the men felt their way with their feet, and upon whom they stumbled in the gloom. The dead were there too. There were dead aplenty. In the first faint gray of morning, when the swarming advance had paused to resume something of definition as a line of battle, and skirmishers had been thrown forward, word was passed along to call the roll. The first sergeant of Lieutenant Dudley's company stepped up to the front and began to name the men in alphabetical order. He had no written roll, but a good memory. The men answered to their names as he ran down the alphabet to G. "Gorham? Here. Grayrock? Here." The sergeant's good memory was affected by habit. "Green? Here." The response was clear, distinct, unmistakable. A sudden movement, an agitation of the entire company front, as from an electric shock, attested to the startling character of the incident. The sergeant paled and paused. The captain strode quickly to his side and said sharply, "Call that name again." Apparently, the Society of Psychical Research is not first in the field of curiosity concerning the unknown. "Bennett Green. Here." All faces turned in the direction of the familiar voice, and two men between whom, in order of stature, Green had commonly stood in line, turned and squarely confronted each other. "Once more!" commanded the inexorable investigator, and once more came, a trifle tremulously, the name of the dead man. "Bennett Story Green! Here!" At that instant a single rifle shot was heard, away to the front, beyond the skirmish line, followed, almost attended, by the savage hiss of an approaching bullet, which passed through the line, struck audibly, punctuating, as with a full stop, the captain's exclamation, "What the devil does it mean?" Lieutenant Dudley pushed through the ranks from his place in the rear. "It means this," he said, throwing open his coat and displaying a visible broadening stain of crimson on his breast. His knees gave out. He fell awkwardly, and lay dead. A little later the regiment was ordered out of line to relieve the congested front, and through some misplay in the game of battle was not again under fire. Nor did Bennett Green, expert in military executions, ever again signify his presence at one.